George Janko recently came out with a podcast laying out a full apology that was very vulnerable about the Jordan Peterson podcast and his mistakes that he had made on that podcast. Now, with this, guys, if you don't know what I'm talking about, guys, recently George Janko had Jordan Peterson on his podcast, and this was a lengthy podcast, and there were a lot of topics discussed and talked about. But George saw a lot of pushback in this podcast. This was George's, as he says, his first podcast he's come out with, and actually it didn't perform in the sense of he got a lot of backlash. He got a lot of kind of quote unquote hate mail from this podcast. And this was the first time he ever faced that. And this was concerning to George. So there were three things that really stood out to me that George Janko apologized for. First and foremost, the one thing that he apologized for at the beginning was to his fiancee, Belle. He made it abundantly clear to her that he does want to get married, that he does want to have a ceremony, and that he is sorry for making it seem like he didn't want those things. Because in the Jordan Peterson podcast, it did come off as though George Janko did not want to have a wedding ceremony. He didn't want to get married in front of a priest or an ordained minister. He didn't want to do any of that because, hey, the Bible doesn't say I need to do that. He made it clear, hey, I've married her in my heart. I've already asked for her father's hand in marriage. He accepted. I'm good. But George did clear it up and correct himself in that area and said, I do want to get married to you, Belle. And she, of course, accepted his apology. And then the other thing that kind of stood out to me in this interview was the way George Janko is very open and willing to take biblical correction. So there were some errors in what he was saying in this podcast. And his followers, his listeners, definitely let him know, and they went to the scriptures about it to correct him biblically. And instead of George being on a high horse, instead of George looking at the platform that he has, the status that he has, instead of looking at that and going, I don't need to listen to these corrections. I know everything. I'm good. No, George humbly, put himself in a place where he said, I need to correct these things. I need to step back and reevaluate where my mistakes were in this interview and go to the scriptures, as that is encouraging to see and hear, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for George Janko's willingness to take biblical correction from anybody. Because truthfully, guys, we are watching the sanctification of George Janko, that process fold out live every single time a podcast is released. We are watching that and knowing that George Janko is a new convert. He's going to say things that are unbiblical, that contradict the scriptures, that don't align with what God teaches. But to see that he is willing to have an open heart, have an open mind, and correct where he needs to be corrected biblically is very encouraging. And it's a big act of humility. And then lastly, there was something he talked about that he wanted to address that was also encouraging. And that was where he was kind of at with this podcast. His channel has hit numbers that a lot of people dream of. He has had people on his podcast that people only dream of interviewing and talking with, and he has had them from Andrew Tate to Candace Owens to Jordan Peterson to a plethora of other people. They seem to want to flock to his podcast. And with that comes a lot of potential, sinful pride. And George made it clear that his fear of the Lord began to dwindle with this Jordan Peterson podcast. And he began to worry about status, worry about views and clicks and what people are saying, and making sure that it was this perfect podcast with Jordan Peterson. And he kind of elevated the podcast of Jordan Peterson over God completely. And he admitted that, which is very encouraging to see him do this, where he had made a mistake, where he had made an error, and he said, hey, listen, I interrupted Jordan Peterson a lot. I said inappropriate questions. I asked inappropriate questions. There were a lot of things that I did that I shouldn't have done. He made that clear to his audience. So that being said, guys, I'm encouraged, and it made me honestly think about a Bible verse in Luke chapter 14, when it says in verse 11, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. George Janko is showing this fruit of humility, this willingness to humble himself before anybody. And that is very encouraging and exciting to see. Real quick, guys, if you enjoyed that video, would you please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing this video, getting it out to other people so everyone else can see how we can look at situations around us in a biblical way. Thank you for your support. Thank you for the encouraging words. And thank you for partnering and subscribing to BTteam Ministries.